So today we're going to have a look at Elastic Beanstalk, which is a AWS hosting platform that merges together all of AWS's services, including RDS, which is the relational database service, S3, which is their storage bucket system, and the hosting platform that represents a VPS. So the first thing we need to do, just to start off with, is to get something that we want to upload. Today I've decided to pull down a copy of Drupal and pick up that 8.6.10 version, the latest and greatest, that says it should work with the dependencies within Beanstalk, but we'll find out today. So what I want to do is, I don't think I've got my hosting platform quite right, because there's probably a few libraries that we'll need to install. I do have a database running. It's MariaDB. I noticed that in Beanstalk there is no ability for you to use MariaDB, so I've gone with the latest possible version of MySQL, and I hope that the two are compatible. I did run into some problems, specifically with the command line interface, the AWS on the console. So I had to do a little bit of tricky dicky stuff. So what I've done is I've recognized that my hosting environment on my local host on my computer is inadequate, and I'll need to make some configuration changes. The first problem is that the environment doesn't host from my user directory, and I tend to like to work in a non-root or a sort of an unprivileged state. So what I'm going to do is check the logs, identify whether it's a SE Linux problem or a permission problem, or even a Apache configuration problem. And I think I've concluded that I'll need to go into the etc folder as root and actually edit the HTTPD configurations, which represents Apache in this particular case. The thing about Beanstalk is we don't really know what technology is driving it. We don't get a shell access into Beanstalk, so we don't actually see the VPS that's technically running. I do keep an eye on this technology, and you should, because it does look like some kind of a container is instantiated for your requirements. But I think there is a far higher level of management that AWS provides with Beanstalk, as opposed to using your own VPS instances. So what I'm concluding is that the user directory configuration is a little bit less than adequate, and that's the allow overrides. So Drupal uses a htaccess method of identifying and then using things like URL rewriting, and I give my site carte blanche, and you can see down the bottom of the screen the allow overrides, file info, auth config, limit indexes. I need more, so all is the answer, but because this is my dev environment, I'm not as judicious as finding out exactly what Drupal needs. It'll be the same with Elastic Beanstalk. When you have a look at it, there's very little you can configure, and we can glean some information from running phpinfo on that server, which we will do. So I'm getting around the installation issues, at least from a serving up pages perspective. But if you see here, I still need to configure extensions. These PHP extensions come with your Elastic Beanstalk hosting environment. Same goes if you instantiate a LAMP stack in Amazon's VPS offerings. But in this case, I'm needing to get my dev environment up to the requirements that Drupal needs. So it'll be things like string manipulation, graphics, in this case graphics manipulation. I'll need OP cache and XML parsing. So I'm going through, I'm checking all the dependencies, and I'm installing each in turn as required. I'm running a Fedora instance of Linux, and Fedora is an example of an OS that is bleeding. So I'll be on the PHP 7.2.15 version by the look of it. That's similar to what Elastic Beanstalk offers. So that's a PHP 7.2 environment, and we know that some Drupal plugins will have difficulty with that version because of what Drupal 7.2 depreciated in terms of its language from 7.1. So I'm still looking at dependencies largely. I don't want to upload Drupal straight away because there's a little bit of hoops that we've got to jump through, a little bit of discovery that we've got to do. But I need to know that my Drupal is working perfectly on my local host. I'm not going to upload anything to the server unless I know Drupal's working fine. So, and the exercise here ultimately is to have your dev environment in your local host and your production environment on Elastic Beanstalk. My argument generally is to have the two equating with each other in some way, shape or form. So in production environments, I'll copy the database back to this instance. I'll do my updates or my changes. I'll move the database one last time back to dev, check everything's working, and then upload my code changes to the running environment. I'll snapshot, and it looks like a Beanstalk creates snapshots automatically. So every version that you upload to Beanstalk is stored as a historical value. The reason being is Beanstalk is designed in such a way as to allow us to scale. So if you set scaling parameters, then Beanstalk will instantiate another copy of your production environment to handle a load. So it's got built-in load balancing and some nice built-in features, which are a pain to set up if you just using Kubernetes or Docker. The disadvantage of course, well, an advantage or disadvantage, is that you really don't have a huge amount of purview into the inner workings of Elastic Beanstalk. You get what you get, and you have to sort of roll with the punches, so to speak. The flip side of that is that you're not going to system administrate Beanstalk. So if there is some security issue with, let's say, PHP 7.2, then Amazon are going to fix that, and they're going to maintain that platform for security and performance. So that takes some of the overhead of managing a environment out of your hands. Because if you just instantiate some kind of EC2 instance, that's your VPS. That's what you own. And you have to administrate that manually, just like you administrate your local host, and take care of all of the dependencies and libraries on your local host. So I'm almost finished my dependency checking. I'm going to restart the server to check to make sure that all of my settings are clear. I'm a little bit quick in this respect, but I've passed all of the dependencies, and I didn't sort of okay through any warnings. I thought I'll fix up all the errors and the warnings. Checking the database exists, and I know the username and password for this database, so it'll be root with no password. That is not what Elastic Beanstalk will accept, even though there seems to be a lot of security around the RDS service. I couldn't get direct access to it from my dev environment, so the RDS instance that I created. So security is implemented by default, in a lot of the subsidiary services that you'll instantiate on AWS. So this is the install process. In most cases, what it's doing is just creating all of the necessary database tables and creating, if I chose to, any sample data. So this installation process ensures that we actually have a working copy of Drupal. And I've already articulated why I would do this. I'd have dev in localhost and production somewhere else. That's nice for me for a latency perspective. Like I can do lots of iterative development in the sub-millisecond speed, whereas if I was on AWS, I would experience some latency. And if a day goes through where I'm sort of refreshing 1,000 times, you end up sort of saving hours of delay in crossing the internet. I know a lot of devs will have a dev environment and a production environment together in AWS, which I think is a good idea, because if you're deploying on Beanstalk, you might as well dev on Beanstalk as well. So I just find, especially in the initial sort of processes of setting up someone's site, it's best to start it off in localhost. Then if you want, you can have a dev version and a production version, each on a URL of their own, and then the client can sign off on the dev version once they've tested it and they're happy with the changes that you've made. You can just copy the snapshot straight over, including any snapshot of the database that you've converted. Drupal does have just depending on the versions you upgrade to, you may have to change the database schema a little bit to meet with those changes. I'm a little behind the times here. What I'm doing is I'm setting up the command line interface for AWS, because the gold standard for moving database information is the command line. And if you have to do your database exports and imports via the phpmyadmin or any HTTP-based environment, you run into sort of the limits of what that environment has. And I note that on Beanstalk, the PHP configuration is set to an upload object limit size of 2 megabytes. So through HTTP, you're significantly limited. So it's worth going through this exercise of setting up your command line tool. Now, what the command line tool needs to have is some private and public key pair or some cipher of some sort, so that you can identify yourself as the bona fide user. So as you're running command line interface commands with AWS, you're not constantly typing in a password over and over again. You hold this private and public key on your AWS command line, and AWS will verify through your private key, which is hidden even from AWS. So AWS don't know your private key, and it's only the public key that they check up on you with. So although I never use this AWS command line tool in the upload process, setting it up has some advantage, because you can do some monitoring. You can write scripts against your production environment to check the health and status every 5 minutes. You can maybe duplicate or export data from the database directly to your machine. So there is some advantages. I ran into the problem of trying to commit the database to the RDS instance because of a clear text requirement that's been set by the RDS service. And this sort of comes into, again, some of the advantages and disadvantages of Amazon's versions of MySQL or Postgres, in that they've made some forks in the open source realm in order to make them work really well on their cloud environment. So as a result, you really have to comply with their wishes and their operational requirements when interacting with the MySQL service. I failed in this instance. I probably need to spend a couple more hours working out how to send SQL directly up to the server. It's the preferred method. because you don't end up with HTTP problems. Now note, I'm checking here that I have SSH. I put all my keys in the .ssh folder of my home directory, and you can see here I've got all kinds of keys set up, but I need to grab the AWS key that I created from my laptop, so I might do that off camera and set it up properly. But ironically, I never use it in this video, so all I'm doing is I'm telling you in this particular 5-minute period, it's a great idea to have that AWS command line utility for the reasons that I've outlined before. So we're already 15 minutes, 16 minutes into the video, and we haven't touched any AWS infrastructure. All I'm doing is setting up my environment so that I can talk to the AWS infrastructure. So here, when you AWS configure, it's going to ask for that all-important public ID and then the secret. And I'm not going to paste this in here. I might skip through, and again, I'll do that off camera. So the next is to describe the default zone or the default region from which you're coming from. And that default region in my case is the Sydney region, so Australia Pacific. And everything that should come back from AWS should be a JSON structure. So I might be able to walk through that JSON structure from a script perspective to find out things that I need. So we've moved to the point where it's time to instantiate our first version of the Elastic Beanstalk. So you have choices. You can create some kind of a service worker for your infrastructure, your back-end infrastructure. So the likelihood with the service worker would be if you wanted to do backups on something, or you wanted to provide some security layer over your database. We're going to make a HTTP instance, and it's accessible through a Beanstalk URL. So we get a subnet name under Beanstalk address structure. You can then CNAME to that. So if you have a domain name, you end up CNAMing directly to that subdomain. The difficulty can be in gaining sort of a more direct access to log files. Although it looks like Beanstalk's pretty good, we can get meaningful logs from our server. The other disadvantage, of course, is that you're sharing a subdomain name with thousands of others. So your name, like Drupal app.env, is unique, and you can't choose common names that are already used by others, like test 1, test 2, test 3. So having a look at the technology choice, it doesn't say what versions of each one of these technologies are, but I think Beanstalk takes leading bleeding, or at least the latest stable releases of all of this software. And to some people that's leading bleeding, especially plugin developers of Drupal, where they might stay a little bit behind the curve, or they might not maintain their plugins, taking into account the depreciation of certain code structures of the PHP language itself. So I'm continuing to read or scan more specifically through the documentation, identifying if there's any changes. This environment changes markedly. I mean, every year I go through this, there's a completely different process. So ironically, the video that I create in 2019 is going to be different to the video that I create in 2021. What I'm doing here is I've read the documentation, and I have this understanding that what I need to do is to look at the environment variables and see maybe if there's any hidden files on my environment, because if I could see might be a .php.ini, or there might be some way of being able to configure my environment a little bit more uniquely. So there's two things that I'm checking, because when we set up our RDS, especially through Beanstalk, what it'll do is it'll quote all of the information about our RDS instance into the Beanstalk instance as an environment variable. So you can see here there's a loop through the server super global in PHP, and I'm just looping through every environment variable. What I'm writing here is just a little statement saying, please show me the home directory. And I just want to see every file that's in the home directory. And then I'll test that on localhost. And if I get some kind of error or I don't get any output at all, I've got a warning. It says, can't find a directory, which is home. So it's saying something sad. So I've got to change my my syntax a little bit just to make sure that I don't get any errors, warnings, or notices. And this is an important thing to do before you upload anything, because once you're up on the server, the browser isn't going to tell you anything about the state of the environment. So so anything that you make a change to on localhost, test it fully, make sure it works to a certain state, and then you can feel confident that once it's up on Beanstalk, it's going to work. There we are. There's all the files that are listed. It doesn't show hidden files, I don't think. I didn't test that, but that was really what I wanted to look at. I wanted to see if there were any, home directory related files. But now I'm happy. There's no errors. Let's zip it up and send it to our first Beanstalk instance, and I'll call it version 1 here. But up on the server, it'll be version 0.1. Note that I'm not uploading Drupal. I'm not uploading phpmyadmin. I just want to test my environment to feel confident about what's happening. So let's upload, and it takes minutes to instantiate our environment. So through the magic of YouTube, I'll do the upload, but we won't wait through the hellish sort of delay it takes for AWS to create a snapshot, register that snapshot, upload the data into AWS instance, the EC2 instance that it creates, and restart the service. None of that is really worth doing. If you're a multitasking type like myself, we can probably export the database from MySQL. We can probably do some configurations to make Drupal and phpmyadmin, as it turns out, ready for hosting on Elastic Beanstalk. I'll put PHP up as a temporary measure to get access to my database. So what I've done here is php.php was a file that contained a function called phpinfo. And what that'll do is it'll tell us what versions of the software. So there are 2 releases behind my laptop here. So 7.2.15 was where we got to on my local host, 7.2.13. So they're really not very far off bleeding, at least staying with the latest stable version of the platform. So I'm just going to scan down to check all the dependencies that Drupal will need. I'm hosed if I need to make any configurations to this environment. I haven't worked it out. I'm sure somebody in a forum knows, but if Drupal doesn't work on Elastic Beanstalk here, you can bet your bottom dollar I'll be going out to look for how to upload a phpini that will override these settings, because a 2 meg limit for file uploads, well, that's okay, well, I think. And a maximum execution time of 30 seconds, well, that's all right. Let's just hope that there's enough horsepower to ensure that no request takes 300 seconds of processing. I also noted that there was only 256 meg associated with the PHP instance. Now that maybe all right. I've had some difficulties with some plugins in Drupal taking up a little bit more memory, and you'll get a notice from your log file saying memory limit exceeded or memory limit run out. I won't test it in this instance, but it would be nice to see whether Elastic Beanstalk will scale with the requirement of Drupal's memory limit crashing. So will it automatically up the PHP memory limit from 256 to 512 or 512 to 1024? I don't know. I doubt it very much. So you may be hosed with particularly complex processing tasks that you make Drupal do, just because of that memory overhead that Drupal has beyond 256 meg. So I'm having a look at the address because I noticed in the server strings you could directly access the service. Now that's the point that I want to make. You are not in the same realm as shared hosting or VPS hosting. You're in a much lower class of shared hosting. So accessing the IP address from which Elastic Beanstalk runs is shared. So there may be 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 tenants all sitting on that one IP address. It's the URL that will define what part or what instance of Beanstalk the service will go to. So you could sort of go test 1 Elastic Beanstalk, test 2 Elastic Beanstalk, and see all of the people that might have gotten in first with their cool names. But ultimately, anyone that uses this in production will CNAME from the Beanstalk domain to their own. So what I'm doing here is looking for a few features. So for example, by default, there is no automatic update. So what we can do is we can tell it every week, go and find any updates from the Amazon core environment, and every Tuesday patch or every Tuesday update. And I think the patch is don't interrupt the service, and update means restart the service. So I'm happy with restart the service. It's, you know, I think restarting the service might be okay. You may have some difficulty with sessions because, again, I didn't check in PHP info whether a session timeout was set, whether it was unlimited. You may find when you restart the service, all user sessions might completely disappear. And that might be okay for your use case, but certainly if it's a shopping cart or some public facing area, you want your sessions to be infinite. And if you restart the service, you may have to store all that session information back to a database, or even have a session server somewhere that has a certain amount of permanence. And there's certainly ways of managing sessions, you know, in a dedicated way, rather than sort of allowing, for example, Beanstalk, one instance of Beanstalk to do it. I think if I was architecting for you know, a million hit an hour site, we'd probably set up an image server, a session management server, you know, a static content server, it'd CDN all of our CSS and JavaScript, and just run anything that needs database interaction on a dedicated host. So every CPU cycle is preserved just for that interactivity element. So what I'm doing here is I'm configuring my RDS service, and I've given, like I said at the beginning of the video, the version to the latest stable, because I notice it stays at MySQL 5, not MySQL 8. So again, there's a little bit of sort of inconsistency, I think, in the way Beanstalk runs its show, because if you choose PHP, you get the latest stable version, but if you choose to run an RDS instance of MySQL, you don't get the latest greatest by default. You'll have to switch up to that latest greatest. And I only did that because, again, my laptop has the current latest iteration of MySQL, specifically MariaDB, and I've seen some inconsistencies starting to appear between the fork Maria as opposed to MySQL. There is no option in Beanstalk at this moment to run MariaDB, and I think I would if I was serious about making sure my dev and production are exactly the same. I would make sure that I would have similar versions of my relational database. I haven't in this case, so I'm not sure whether that's a fault of me or a fault of Amazon. I haven't found the edges of Amazon's RDS service. As I said, I think that although they show versions of the open source environment, I believe that they've been changed in some significant way to run effectively on their platform, so that you can scale, you can provide failover. There has to be some change to the way MySQL works. Again, their security model is pretty unique. It's different to what I showed you with the command line tool, but you need the command line tool to create session keys or IAMs to access, so temporary access tokens to access external resources. But because we created our RDS instance inside Beanstalk, all the configurations to make sure Beanstalk and the RDS instance talk to each other have been pre-configured by Amazon. If you created, let's say, an EC2 instance and an RDS instance separately, you're going to have to configure some kind of security model for the two to talk to each other. Generally, that RDS instance is firewalled from access from anywhere. So you end up having to make sure your RDS instance works first. So what I'm doing here is I'm just recording everything I know about this database instance. So the URL you get to it, the port number that it uses, the username and password that I created to access it. So this information will come in very handy when it comes time to either do any remote access or introduce phpmyadmin and or Drupal to access the database, because they'll need that full URL there in order to access. Now, I'm not convinced that the open internet can access that URL. Again, it's firewalled from direct access, which is why what I did was in the version 2 of this upload, I'm copying up phpmyadmin. So in the trusted realm of Beanstalk, what I'm doing is I'm using a HTTP interface to communicate with the MySQL server directly. So I'm just here checking to make sure that I think phpmyadmin will work. I was searching for the version number of phpmyadmin, identifying that it's configured to use cookies such that we can log in with the username and password that's right, and we're going to be able to successfully use this interface. I do have to make one change to the config.inc file before sending this up to the server, and that is to use the environment variable that we saw when we printed out the entire string of $_ server. That's super global in PHP. So we saw all the server strings. So I need to make a copy of my own phpmyadmin that's sitting on the root of my web server and bring it into our little Drupal app that we will zip up and send to the server. So config.inc.php needs to have the credentials if you want, but you can see here there's some credential information like username and password you can put in directly into this configuration. I do not like the idea of embedding the actual credentials. I think that represents a security risk. So if you end up starting to sort of type in verbatim the exact username and the exact password actually into files, then you're coming up against what I would consider a sort of a proper security risk. So this is one reason why Beanstalk will create these environment variables that are exposed just to the hosting environment. This data shouldn't be available to the open internet. So again, I'm engaging in what could be considered a security risk by running a script that provides the internals of the hosting environment, but I do that for the half an hour that's necessary to sort of glean information that I deem useful. I can get this from the AWS console, but it's good to get it from 2 or 3 sources. Like with any kind of information, if you can get it from 2 or 3 sources, you feel more confident that you're dealing with information that's true and correct. So this is the first time that I've actually seen the database name. I wasn't able to glean the database name from RDS directly, so I'm not getting that from multiple sources. I might be able to get that from phpmyadmin once I've uploaded it to the server. So I won't need this file anymore. In fact, I'll get rid of the phpinfo and this little server.php file completely once we go into production. So on version 1.0, I'm going to have a working version of Drupal. So you can see the settings of Drupal will need to be changed, and those same server strings will need to go into Drupal settings.php. And again, if you just copy the database name, the server name, the username, and the password, what you're doing there is you're starting to record information in perpetuity in a more public realm. So these pages, if someone could denial of service AWS and take out the PHP interpreter and then try to hit settings.php, that page or every line of code there could be rendered to a browser. So we don't really want username and password information to be possibly gleaned by the open internet. So the idea is to use these server strings that have been created as environment variables, so that we're a little bit safer. The other point that I want to make is that your local host and your production versions of settings are going to be different. So on localhost, you root with no password, your database is on localhost, so you're going to have to go through the hell of maintaining 2 versions of settings.php, and you'll see me swapping between the 2 settings, because once I put this together, there is no way that my Drupal will work again. So if I need to do any changes or any alterations to Drupal itself here on my local host, I need to swap back my settings local host from as opposed to my settings that are filled with environment variables. Those people, and again, there's some advantage in having a dev in production, but in Beanstalk itself, I can't get into the console and maybe edit files directly. So dev in production should probably be on two platforms. Beanstalk is a hosting platform, in my opinion, not a dev platform. So you may have some advantage in, let's say, running Amazon Linux as an EC2 instance, and giving permission to your EC2 instance to access the RDS directly. And that's the next option when dealing with SQL files. If I wanted to do a dump of the database, I'd probably need to be inside the envelope or inside the tent, so to speak, to do what I need to do. And running a version of, let's say, Amazon Linux, you're guaranteed to have their software library, their well, I can't think of the name now, when I use yum or apt-get package management. So Amazon will manage its RDS versions of MySQL and its RDS versions of MariaDB and Postgres and Oracle and SQL Server. So if you've got a Amazon Linux running, chances are you end up running compatible versions of all of these in a dev environment. So there is something to be said about leaving your laptop. And, I've personally thought about, going to a Chromebook for those particular reasons, because, once you have your environment hosted, maybe your dev should be hosted. And a Chromebook would force me to change my paradigm a little bit. I wouldn't live in localhost anymore. I'd have to do all my dev online. The one saving grace, I think, is that Chromebooks now support a certain type of VPS environment. I'm not sure whether it's boxes or KVM, but it'll be some open source version of a virtualization suite, and then I'll be able to run sort of a full OS on my laptop if I needed to. But anyway, I digress. So what I'm doing here is I'm currently looking at the AWS instance of phpmyadmin. So I've gone and uploaded everything to the server. So I've gone version 2, or as AWS knows it, version 0.2, and I'm trying to upload the file to the server. Now, what happens, well, I did this in the first instance with a non-zip file, and that non-zip file failed on me. So I ended up having to zip up my my instance and uploading that separately. So you can see here I failed, the upload failed, and I'm going back to the command line and I'm going to zip that guy up. It wasn't, I don't think it was an upload error. I think it was more a sort of a processing limit that was reached. So because you can see the file, well, maybe not, the file Drupal 8610.sql was below the 2 meg limit, but maybe there was a processing limit that it reached. So if I zip that guy up and upload him again, I'm going to get a little bit better off. So just bear that in mind. Eventually your Drupal database is going to get too big for dealing with it through this mechanism. You're going to have to get the command line tool to work. In this instance, it worked all right because I've got essentially an empty Drupal. There's no data in it. It's just a default installation. So things worked all right in this instance, but I wouldn't call this a particularly elegant solution to dealing with the RDS instance. We're going to have to find a better way, and maybe next video I'll have worked that one out. So I'm going to do the test, just test to see whether Drupal comes up. Drupal actually works, because I've created the database. Why not, just, hopefully, or not. So this opens up an interesting point, because what went wrong? We don't know. The server isn't going to tell us anything, and it's important to know, even in dev, Drupal's going to obfuscate the physical error that it got, and you won't see what went wrong. Now, there's two ways of looking at logs. First is in the admin area of Drupal itself, and the second is in looking at the log files of Elastic Beanstalk. So this is where I'm going to now. I'm clicking on the logs section, and I'm going to extract the first 100 lines, and then I can look at that as a text file. So if you go down to the bottom, that last line there tells us what went wrong, and it says SQL state. So it's a PDO exception. The great thing about Symfony is that it shows the whole set of steps that it goes through before it fails. But the actual failure looks like it's some kind of SQL error. So my guess is it's related to my settings file. I have a feeling that I didn't set up my settings file right. So this is an iterative process. So in the first instance, what I've done is I've uploaded just my debugging files, the phpinfo, the server.php, and I may have to write even more PHP to try and inspect or introspect the inner workings of Beanstalk with regards to the way that the PHP interpreter works. This version 2 was an attempt to upload phpmyadmin and identify that we have a database, and we've used the phpmyadmin interface to clean up things. I'm going to have to upload again because I've got a syntax error. So if you look at the prefix line just below the highlighted password, I've gone and stuffed up. I've actually put an extra array element into the structure, and that server array element should be gotten rid of because it represents the prefix for the tables. So if you had Drupal 1, Drupal 2, Drupal 3, Drupal 4, and you only had one database that you could deal with, that prefix will create separation between each one of the Drupal instance. So I'm doing a switcheroo. I'm making sure that settings.php and settings.env, which is the environment variables version of settings, are up to date, are the same as each other. And now I'm going to go through the process of rezipping the entire lot, both phpmyadmin and Drupal and my debugging and anything else that I need to make the platform work properly. So I'm sort of giving you my dirty laundry in regards to the failure processes that I'm experiencing with this. I think most videos will show you all of the successes, and the videos will be 15 minutes instead of 50, because it's a fluid process. The fluid process can be useful, but so too some of the difficulties. And I want to show you the log files. I want to show you a technique for instantiating the database, and all that sort of ensues. So upload version 3. Again, these deployments or these snapshots that AWS creates from each zip file that I upload take in the order of about 15 minutes. So it depends on the time of day. It depends on how many resources Amazon allocates to Beanstalk in the region that you're working, but it is slow, and I think it's slow because of its logging nature, of the fact that it wants to remember every step of the process. Now, ironically, I still come into a problem, and this is a problem with Drupal. So I can view the home page, but when I click on something like login, the address seems to hold on to some memory of the previous URLs that I used in dev. So you can see that ~jp, and so we're a little bit screwed. What I need to do is I need to clear the MySQL cache. I will need to upload the database again. I will need to I'll need to make sure that the environment is pretty clear of all my testing. So I'm confident at this point that my process is okay. It was just a oversight on my part right at the beginning of this video, where I should go into my localhost version under performance. I hit that button that says clear cache. It takes a couple of minutes, but what it does is it dumps all of the copies of static information that it's got in cache. So it doesn't have to hit the database so often or have to sort of pull as many tables. So that caching mechanism is a performance issue. But I need to go into my localhost version, re-export the database, re-upload the database into AWS, and try that whole process again. when I'm confident, what I'm going to do is to create a version 1.0 of my Beanstalk application without phpmyadmin, which in itself is a security risk, and without any of my testing, either my phpinfo or print every one of the server elements in the superglobal. I do like to export with the drop tables because you don't have great purview into the RDS environment. It's a black. They try to make it as much of a black box as possible. That drop table statement is important because if you try to create table that already exists, you'll throw an error. And especially if you're sort of halfway through a big SQL dump, you probably want that drop tables. Drop table, if exists, is I think the line that appears before each one. So now I'm just going to take that SQL, that updated SQL, and zip that SQL up so that it can be uploaded into the phpmyadmin that's already there, that's configured correctly. So I'm happy with the information. I'm going to zip up just Drupal and nothing else. So I'll double check my settings, make sure my settings are okay, and make sure that I'm not going to use the localhost version of the settings file, and then I just want to zip up Drupal and nothing else. So because Elastic Beanstalk is largely a production environment, we're just going to focus on production related stuff. So I think sort of after a night, because I recorded this video yesterday and I'm annotating it today, after a one night sleep, I wouldn't use this for dev, because it's kind of a black box, and what you're doing is you're outsourcing security management, performance management, failover management, scalability to Amazon. Amazon is going to take care of all of that for you and just bill you at the end of each month. So if your site's super popular, you're never going to get a performance hit. But if you want a certain amount of control, you may have to sort of think about rolling your own. And I did note while I was doing this yesterday that there is a way of rolling your own instances of Beanstalk. But of course you don't get the advantages of Amazon doing its constant upgrades of version control, which I think is one of the core benefits of using Elastic Beanstalk. So horses for courses. A lot of organizations that do have dozens of sysadmins and network engineers might consider using a more portable platform, because of course Beanstalk only exists on AWS. It doesn't exist on Azure or Google Cloud. Those people who do have a fairly hefty budget will look at Kubernetes, will look at Docker, will build and roll their own environment to their own specification. And, I applaud that. But for the rest of us, Beanstalk makes a very compelling argument for zero administration. So I've proved here that I can create a new page on the Beanstalk environment, and everything seems to work fine. So that was the success of Elastic Beanstalk. So thanks for watching. I appreciate the individuals that made it to the end.